War has always had its monsters, but not all of them wore enemy uniforms. In the winter of 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe, soldiers faced dangers that couldn't be found on any tactical map. Artillery fire, snipers, frostbite, disease. These were the known threats the ones command briefed you about. The ones that made sense within the brutal logic of warfare. But there were other dangers. Ones that defied military doctrine. Ones that shouldn't exist. This is the story of 3 separate Allied units. American, British, and Canadian, who encountered something that still has no place in official military histories. Each group, operating hundreds of miles apart during the winter offensive of 1944–45, reported encounters with a figure they would only describe as the Doctor, not a German physician, not a field medic on rogue, something else entirely. The accounts share disturbing similarities. A medical professional appearing where no medical personnel should be, offering treatment that seemed to heal, but at a cost. Soldiers who accepted his help survived wounds that should have killed them, yet were never quite the same afterward. What follows are 3 documented incidents drawn from declassified after-action reports, personal letters, and decades-later interviews with survivors. The military never officially acknowledged these events. No investigation was ever launched. The witnesses were scattered across different units, different nations, with no way to compare their stories. Yet the stories align in ways that can't be easily dismissed. Tonight, we examine what they saw, what they survived, and what they refused to forget. If you're interested in more accounts like these, stories pulled from the edges of military history where the official record goes silent, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the experiences that don't make it into textbooks, the testimonies that challenge what we think we know about war. Now, let's step into the fog of war. December 18th, 1944. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had just begun, catching Allied forces completely off guard. The U.S. 99th Infantry Division found itself surrounded, cut off, and taking massive casualties in the frozen forest. Communication lines were down, supply routes were severed, and the temperature was dropping below zero. Private First Class James Holloway's unit had been decimated in the first wave, 17 men reduced to 6 in a matter of hours. 3 of those 6 were wounded, including Holloway himself. Shrapnel from a mortar had torn through his abdomen, leaving a wound that was bleeding faster than his buddies could pack it. Without proper medical attention, he had hours, at most, maybe less. They were deep in enemy territory with no way to call for evacuation. The nearest aid station was miles away, and they'd never make it through the German lines. Holloway knew it. His sergeant knew it. They were carrying him because that's what you did. You didn't leave your men behind, but everyone understood they were just delaying the inevitable. That's when they found the tent. It appeared through the snow and pine trees like something out of a dream. A proper medical tent, complete with Red Cross markings on the canvas, standing in a small clearing where no clearing should have been. No tracks leading to it, no equipment scattered around it. Just the tent, pristine and waiting, as if it had been expecting them. The letter that documents what happened next was written 3 months later, after Holloway had been shipped home and medically discharged. He wrote it to his sister Sarah in March of 1945. The letter was discovered in family archives in 1987, 42 years after it was written, tucked inside a Bible that had belonged to Holloway's mother. It reads, "Sarah, I'm only writing this down because I know you'll believe me. The Army sure as hell won't. We stumbled on this medical tent, honest to God, Red Cross markings, and everything right there in the middle of nowhere. Made no sense. We were miles behind enemy lines, surrounded by Germans, but Jenkins was dying, and I wasn't far behind him. The doctor was already inside, waiting, like he knew we were coming. He was tall, Sarah, impossibly tall, Had to duck under the tent ceiling even though it was at least 8 feet high. Wore a proper medical uniform, but I couldn't tell you which army. The insignia kept shifting whenever I tried to focus on them. American 1 second, maybe German the next, maybe something else entirely. My eyes couldn't hold on to what they were seeing. His hands were wrong. The fingers were too long, and they moved in ways that made your eyes hurt to watch. But he worked fast. He operated on Jenkins right there on a table that hadn't been there a second before. No anesthesia, but Jenkins didn't scream. None of us could make a sound while the doctor worked. It was like our voices had been turned off. He stitched Jenkins up with what looked like silver thread. Not surgical sutures, actual silver, like jeweler's wire, but flexible. It caught the light from the lanterns in ways that didn't seem right. When he turned to me, his face... God, Sarah, I can't describe his face. Every time I try to remember it, I see something different. Sometimes it's kind, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it doesn't look like a face at all, just the idea of one. He asked me one question. Do you want to live? I said yes. What else could I say? I was bleeding out on a forest floor in Belgium. I had maybe an hour left. He operated. I don't remember the procedure. I remember his hands moving, and the silver thread, and a pain that wasn't quite pain, more like feeling something fundamental being rearranged inside you. When he finished, the wound was closed. Not healed, but closed, stitched tight with that silver thread. I survived. We all survived that night. But Sarah, I dream about that tent every single night. And in the dreams, I'm still on that table, still being stitched together, still feeling those 2 long fingers working inside me, and he's still smiling. If you could call it smiling, the letter ends there, mid-thought, as if Holloway couldn't bring himself to finish the description. James Holloway survived the Battle of the Bulge. So did Private Anthony Jenkins, the soldier mentioned in the letter. Both men made it home in 1945. Both were decorated for their service. Both received honorable discharges. According to military medical records, Holloway's wounds should have been fatal without immediate surgical intervention at a field hospital. His own unit reported he was expectedly terminal in their last radio contact before being cut off from command. Yet, when U.S. forces finally reached the surrounded unit 3 days later, 3 days of sub-zero temperatures and continued German attacks, Holloway was mobile and functional. The wound had been expertly closed with surgical precision that exceeded what most field medics could achieve, even under ideal conditions. The Army medical examiner who processed Holloway's discharge noted something unusual in his report. The notation reads, "Sutures used on abdominal wound are not standard military issue. Material appears to be unknown metallic thread, possibly salvaged German medical supplies or improvised from available materials. Wound closure is professionally executed. Recommend routine follow-up." The metallic thread was never analyzed. The report was filed and forgotten. Jenkins fared worse. He survived physically but was discharged in 1946 with what records vaguely describe as severe psychological distress and dissociative episodes. He spent the rest of his life in and out of VA psychiatric facilities, repeatedly telling doctors that something was still inside him, still stitching. He died in 1973. The cause of death was listed as complications from chronic mental illness. 3 other men from that unit survived the Battle of the Bulge. All 3 refused to discuss what happened in the forest. Sergeant Michael Vance, the ranking survivor, gave only one statement when pressed by Army investigators looking into the unit's unusual survival rate. "We found shelter. A medic treated our wounded. That's all there is to tell." But when questioned separately, in different interviews conducted months apart, each survivor described the same details. The tent that appeared where no tent should have been, the impossibly tall doctor with the shifting insignia, the silver thread, the operating table that materialized from nothing. the unnatural silence that fell over the forest while the doctor worked. The men described the tent as pristine despite the surrounding snow and mud. Inside, it was warm, unnaturally so, given the sub-zero temperatures outside. The smell was wrong too. Not antiseptic or blood, which is what you'd expect in a medical tent. Instead, they smelled something organic and sweet, like flowers blooming in a place flowers had no business growing. The lanterns inside the tent burned without visible fuel. Their light was steady and bright, but cast shadows that moved independently of the people in the tent. One survivor reported watching his own shadow reach for equipment before his hand moved. Outside, the sounds of battle had completely ceased. No artillery in the distance, no gunfire, no engines, just absolute silence pressing in from the dark forest. A silence so complete it felt like physical pressure against their eardrums. When the doctor worked, the only sound was the whisper of that silver thread being pulled through flesh, a sound one man described as like wind through winter branches, another as distant singing in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. When they left the tent at dawn, weak but alive, they turned back to look. The tent was gone. Only undisturbed snow remained, unmarked by footprints or tent stakes, or any evidence that anything had ever been there. 6 men entered that tent. 5 survived the immediate aftermath. 3 made it home intact, at least physically. The Army's official report lists their survival as fortunate outcome of undetermined field treatment. No Red Cross or Army medical unit was ever documented operating in that sector during that time frame. German forces later confirmed they had no medical facilities in that area during the period in question. The 99th Infantry Division's chaplain noted something in his personal diary. An entry dated January 1945. 17 men from various units have now claimed to encounter a medical tent in the woods during the German offensive. All 17 survived wounds that medical staff classified as likely fatal. None can explain how they received treatment. None can explain where the tent came from or where it went. The men are not hysterical. They are not fabricating. They saw something. I believe them. I don't understand what they saw, but I believe they saw it. All 17 men survived to see the end of the war. None of them could explain how. When British forces liberated the small castle outside Kassel, Germany in March 1945, they found something that would puzzle military investigators for months afterward. 17 wounded German soldiers. Alive, stable, imprisoned in the castle's dungeon, not held by enemy forces, imprisoned by their own army. The cell doors had been welded shut from the outside. Food and water had been passed through slots in the doors for weeks. The Wehrmacht had posted guards with explicit orders: shoot anyone who tries to leave, and prevent any military medical personnel from entering under any circumstances. The British medical officer who first examined the prisoners reported they were in impossibly good health, considering their documented injuries. Each soldier bore evidence of severe combat trauma burns, gunshot wounds, amputations, shrapnel damage. Yet all wounds showed signs of advanced healing despite the complete lack of proper medical care or supplies. The German soldiers were terrified, not of their British captors of being released. When interviewed separately by British intelligence, 16 of them told variations of the same story about why they'd been locked in that dungeon. The 17th soldier, a Luftwaffe pilot named Klaus Richter, refused to speak at all. He would spend the next 3 weeks staring at his hands and weeping silently. To understand what happened, we have to work backward. 6 weeks earlier, in late January 1945, the castle had been hastily converted into an emergency Wehrmacht field hospital as Allied forces closed in from the west. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors were scarcer. Wounded German soldiers were being triaged in hallways, dying on stretchers because there weren't enough surgeons to save them and not enough morphine to ease their passing. That's when he appeared. No one remembered him arriving. He was simply there one morning, walking the corridors in a doctor's coat that was spotlessly clean despite the blood and mud everywhere else. The German medical staff assumed he'd been sent from divisional headquarters, another doctor reassigned as the fronts collapsed. He carried proper documentation, identification papers that seemed legitimate, but that no one could later recall examining closely. His manner was professional. His German was flawless, though some staff noted his accent was unusual, not regional, exactly, but somehow old-fashioned, as if he'd learned the language from books written generations ago. He offered to help with the worst cases, the ones who wouldn't survive the night. The commanding medical officer, Dr. Heinrich Vogel, was desperate enough to accept without asking too many questions. He directed the stranger to the castle's lower levels, where they'd moved the terminal cases 17 men who were expected to die before morning. Soldiers for whom morphine was the only remaining treatment, because surgery wouldn't save them and bandages were needed for men with better chances. Dr. Vogel gave his statement to British interrogators on March 24th, 1945. The transcript records that his hands never stopped shaking. I thought he was a miracle. By dawn, all 17 were stable. Men I had personally written off, men with wounds that should have killed them within hours, were sitting up, talking. Some were even eating. Wounds that should have required weeks of surgical intervention and months of recovery were closing before my eyes. I asked him what technique he'd used, what drugs, what procedures. Modern medicine couldn't explain what I was seeing. He smiled and said, "I simply gave them what they needed most." I should have asked what he meant. I should have questioned further. But I was exhausted, and I had 60 other patients who needed care, and 17 men were alive who should have been dead. I thanked him and went back to work. That's when the screaming started. The testimony of Corporal Ernst Weber, infantry, provides more detail. The pain stopped. That was the first sign something was wrong. I had burns across 60% of my body, third-degree burns from a flamethrower. I should have been in agony, but I felt nothing. Then I looked down and saw my skin moving. Not healing, moving. Like something underneath was rearranging everything. I watched my skin ripple and shift, watched new tissue form. But it wasn't forming naturally. It was being constructed, assembled, by something inside me that shouldn't have been there. Lieutenant Friedrich Stein, Panzer Corps. My leg had been amputated above the knee 3 days prior. I'd accepted it, mourned it, even. When I woke after the doctor's treatment, the leg was back. Not prosthetic. Real. Flesh and bone. But it wasn't my leg. I don't mean it looked different. I mean when I tried to move it, something else moved it first. Like sharing control with something that had borrowed my body. Like being a passenger in my own skin. Sergeant Otto Klein, artillery. We all felt it at the same time around 3 in the morning, like waking up and realizing you're not alone in your own skin. Something was moving inside us. Not organs, not anything medical. Something conscious. Something that had been installed. Conscious. Dr. Vogel found them huddled together in the lower ward at dawn, all 17 patients trying to keep each other calm despite their growing panic. One soldier was trying to remove his own stitches with a piece of broken glass. Another was repeatedly whispering prayers while his eyes tracked something no one else could see moving across the ceiling. Vogel examined them and found the impossible. Their wounds had healed, yes, but the healing was still happening. Tissue was rearranging itself beneath closed skin. Bones were restructuring in ways that human bones shouldn't move. One soldier's heartbeat was audible from across the room, but the rhythm was wrong. Too fast and too regular, like a machine trying to imitate life. The doctor was gone. No one had seen him leave. The guards at the castle entrance had no record of anyone departing. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist once his work was complete. When Vogel reported this to the castle's Wehrmacht commander, the immediate response was quarantine and confinement. The 17 men were locked in the dungeon within hours. Orders came down from higher command. No one was to enter those cells. No medical personnel were to examine them further. The men were to be held indefinitely, pending further instructions that never came. British investigators later discovered that similar incidents had been reported at 3 other German medical facilities between December 1944 and February 1945. Each time, a mysterious doctor had appeared, treated seemingly terminal cases with miraculous results, then vanished before questions could be asked. In each case, the survivors were subsequently imprisoned by their own military. In 2 of those incidents, the prisoners had not survived their confinement. The causes of death were listed vaguely as complications from treatment and unknown metabolic failure. The British medical examiner, who conducted autopsies on those remains, reported findings that were immediately classified and removed from the official record. A single line survived in his personal notes: internal structures inconsistent with human anatomy. Tissue samples impossible to classify. Recommend immediate cremation. The 17 men from the castle were held by British forces for 3 months, kept under constant medical observation at a facility near Hamburg. Slowly, whatever had been done to them seemed to fade. Their bodies returned to more normal states. The wounds remained healed, but the unsettling movement beneath their skin ceased. Their heartbeats normalized. The sense of something else residing inside them gradually diminished. Most were eventually repatriated. Several disappeared from records entirely, their final dispositions unknown. Klaus Richter, the pilot who never spoke during his confinement, finally broke his silence 2 days before his scheduled release. He said only 7 words to his British doctor, then smiled a smile the doctor later described in his report as not entirely his own. The 7 words: "He's still here. He's always here." Richter was found dead in his cell the next morning. The cause of death was listed as suicide, though the British medical examiner noted privately that the method would have required Richter to possess inhuman strength and anatomical flexibility. What do you think happened in that castle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. On January 23, 1945, the Royal Canadian Navy corvette HMCS Moose Jaw responded to a distress signal from a damaged American submarine approximately 180 nautical miles southeast of Newfoundland. Weather conditions were severe, visibility was near zero, and the North Atlantic in winter was as dangerous as any combat zone. The official incident report, declassified in 1995, tells a straightforward story. At 0430 hours, HMCS Moose Jaw responded to distress signal from USS MAAO, SS 225. Upon arrival at 0510 hours, submarine was located partially surfaced, listing 15 degrees, showing evidence of depth charge damage from earlier engagement with U-boat. Rescue operations commenced immediately. Submarine crew of 68 men evacuated successfully. Medical officer reported 1 fatality, 12 serious injuries, remainder in fair condition. Submarine scuttled at 0645 hours per standard protocol for irreparable damage. All survivors transferred to Halifax Naval Hospital upon arrival. Recovery rates exceeded expectations given severity of conditions and injuries sustained. Commanding officers' commendations submitted for Lieutenant Commander Morrison and rescue crew for exceptional performance under hazardous conditions. No further action required. The report is professional, thorough, and utterly routine. It's also, according to multiple survivors, almost entirely false. In 1989, naval historian Dr. Patricia Hammond conducted a series of interviews with USS Mako survivors as part of her research into North Atlantic submarine operations. One of those interviews was with former Petty Officer Michael Chen. The recording of that interview has since been deposited in the Naval War College archives. Chen's account differs significantly from the official record. The official story. That's what they told us to say. That's what we testified to at the inquiry. That's what went in all our service records. Everyone involved agreed we'd tell the same story, keep our mouths shut, and try to forget what really happened. Took me 44 years to break that promise. The Mako wasn't damaged by depth charges. We were damaged by something hitting us from below. Something big. Something that wasn't another submarine. Whatever it was, it cracked our pressure hull in 3 places and flooded 2 compartments. We had 18 men trapped in the aft torpedo room with water rising and no way to reach them. The bulkhead door was jammed. We tried everything, cutting torches, hydraulic rams, brute force. Nothing worked. The metal had buckled in the impact. That door wasn't opening, and the men on the other side knew it. We could hear them pounding on the bulkhead for the first 10 minutes. Then, the pounding stopped. We knew what that meant. When we surfaced, barely surfaced, the boat was listing so badly, the hull was buckled so severely, we couldn't get the main hatches open either. We were taking on water, listing harder by the minute. And those 18 men were already dead or dying 1 deck below us. That's when someone appeared on deck. Just materialized out of the fog and spray. We didn't see him come up through the conning tower. We didn't see him climb aboard. He was just there. Tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing some kind of diving suit that didn't look like anything I'd seen before or since. It was seamless, like it had been molded onto his body. He went below, down through the damaged hatch that we couldn't open, that shouldn't have opened, but somehow did for him. Just pulled it open with his bare hands like it was a cabinet door, not a warped steel hatch that weighed 300 pounds. 20 minutes later, he came back up. The 18 men followed him. They were soaked, half drowned, some of them with burst blood vessels in their eyes from the pressure change. But they were alive, all 18. Men who had been underwater in a flooded compartment for over 20 minutes. They should have drowned or suffered irreversible brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Instead, they were alive and conscious. The doctor, that's what we called him afterward, though I don't know why he didn't speak. Just nodded once toward the men, then went over the side, into the Atlantic, in the middle of a winter storm. 60-foot swells, near freezing water, winds at 40 knots. He didn't surface. We told the Canadians we'd managed to open the compartment ourselves through some heroic engineering effort. They didn't believe us. How could they? But they didn't push. I think they were just glad to have survivors to rescue. The Mako was going down fast. They got us off 30 minutes before she sank. The official report says we lost 1 man. We actually lost none. 68 crew, 68 survivors. The one fatality was invented to explain why our story didn't quite add up. Chief Petty Officer Robert Walsh, one of the 18 men pulled from the flooded torpedo room, gave an unofficial statement to researchers in 1987. Everything in Chen's account is accurate. I was trapped in that compartment. Water was up to our chests when the bulkhead door opened, a door that was jammed shut, that we'd been told would require cutting equipment we didn't have. He reached in and pulled us out one by one. His hands were cold, not like touching human skin, like touching something that had never been warm. But his grip was strong, and he didn't let go until we were all on deck. The weird part, the part I still dream about, is that while we were underwater, drowning, I wasn't afraid. Something was in that compartment with us before he opened the door. Something that kept us calm, kept us from panicking. It's the only reason we didn't all die from inhaling water in our panic. The official medical report from Halifax Naval Hospital states, survivors exhibit signs consistent with near drowning, hypothermia, and standard submarine emergency evacuation trauma. 3 cases of pulmonary edema successfully treated. All patients responding to treatment within expected parameters. But a letter from Naval Hospital Dr. Thomas Barrett to a colleague, a letter never sent, found in his personal effects after his death, tells a different story. The Mako survivors are lying about something. The physical evidence doesn't match their story. These men should have died. The ones pulled from the flooded compartment had been underwater for at least 20 minutes, based on the timeline they should have drowned or suffered irreversible brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Instead, they're fine. Better than fine. Their lung function is perfect. Their neurological exams are completely normal. And there's something else. I examined all 68 men. 12 of them, including all 18 from the flooded compartment, have identical marks on their chests. Small scars, perfectly circular, arranged in a pattern I don't recognize. The pattern looks almost like a constellation. 7 points arranged in a specific geometric relationship. When I asked about them, every man claimed they were old scars from unrelated incidents. 12 identical scars. 12 identical lies. Something happened on that submarine that none of them want to discuss. Something that saved their lives, but that they can't or won't explain. 3 additional accounts, collected from Mako survivors over the decades, mention details that appear nowhere in official records. The 18 men from the flooded compartment never felt cold again. Even decades later, living in various parts of the United States and Canada, they would walk outside in winter without coats and feel nothing. One survivor, Joseph Martinez, moved to Fairbanks, Alaska, in 1952 specifically, to see if I could find temperatures that registered. He never found them. He died in 1994 at age 73, found frozen in his backyard in January wearing only a t-shirt and jeans. The coroner ruled it death by exposure, but Martinez's body showed no signs of hypothermia. His body temperature at time of death was normal. Several men reported recurring dreams of being underwater, breathing normally, seeing things moving in the deep darkness. Always the same dream, always the same depths. In the dreams, something massive moves through the water, and they understand without knowing how they understand that it's allowing them to breathe. And there was the matter of the Mako herself. When Canadian Navy divers later inspected the wreck for salvage assessment, they found the aft torpedo room's bulkhead door. It hadn't been opened from either side through any conventional means. It had been torn completely off its hinges from the outside. The metal was warped outward, as if something had pulled it off while underwater with enough force to bend 3-inch reinforced steel like aluminum foil. The official report estimated it would have required hydraulic equipment capable of generating over 50 tons of force. No such equipment existed in 1945. No such equipment exists today that could function at depth underwater. The official record says the men saved themselves through training and courage. The survivors say something pulled them from the depths. The physical evidence suggests something impossibly strong reached into a flooded submarine compartment and extracted 18 drowning men one by one. The question remains: which version serves the truth? Which version serves the survivors? And perhaps most importantly, which version allows everyone involved to sleep at night? The Navy closed the case in 1945. The men kept their silence for decades. The Mako rests on the ocean floor 300 feet down, her secrets locked inside a tomb of steel and salt water. And somewhere, according to those who were there, the doctor still walks the depths. 3 incidents, 3 countries, 3 branches of military service, hundreds of miles and multiple months separating them, yet the accounts share impossible consistency. A medical figure appearing where none should exist, providing treatment that saved lives in ways that can't be medically explained, then vanishing without explanation or trace. The skeptical explanation is straightforward enough. Wartime stress produces folklore. Soldiers facing death create myths to explain their survival. Guilt over surviving when others died manifests as supernatural narratives that absolve the survivors of pure chance. If something otherworldly intervened, then their survival had meaning rather than being mere random luck. This explanation is reasonable. It's psychologically sound. It accounts for the shared details as cultural contamination stories spreading through military networks, soldiers unconsciously conforming their accounts to match what they'd heard from others. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the metallic sutures in James Holloway's abdomen sutures that Army medical examiners couldn't identify and described as being made from an unknown material. It doesn't explain why German military command would imprison their own wounded soldiers rather than celebrate their miraculous recovery or study whatever treatment had saved them. It doesn't explain the Mako's torn bulkhead door or the identical circular scars on 18 sailors who claimed they'd never met before being assigned to the same submarine. The official military records are careful, clinical, and deliberately vague. No formal investigations were launched. No follow-up inquiries were made. The incidents were documented just thoroughly enough to be filed and forgotten, but not thoroughly enough to be explained. Was this institutional oversight or institutional avoidance? When something happens that doesn't fit the existing framework of understanding, there's an impulse to classify it as anomalous and move on. The alternative, acknowledging that something occurred outside the boundaries of accepted reality, creates too many uncomfortable questions. We know that dozens of soldiers across multiple Allied and Axis forces claimed encounters with this figure during the winter of 1944–45. We know that these encounters cluster around periods of intense combat and heavy casualties. We know that survival rates among those claiming the encounters were statistically anomalous. The men who reported these experiences survived wounds that medical science said should have killed them. What we don't know, what perhaps cannot be known, is whether this represents shared psychological trauma, creating a comforting narrative, unexplained medical intervention from an unknown source, or something that exists in the uncomfortable space between the two. The men who were there made their choices about what to believe. Many took their full stories to their graves, leaving only fragments and implications behind. They survived the war. They survived their wounds. They came home to families and careers and lives that continued for decades after 1945. Whether they survived unchanged is a question their families still struggle to answer. James Holloway's daughter told an interviewer in 1995 that her father would wake screaming from nightmares several times a week for 30 years. He never spoke about what he dreamed, but he died with his hand pressed to his abdomen, to the scar where the silver thread had closed a mortal wound. Klaus Richter's smile, the one his British doctor described as not entirely his own, appears in photographs of several other survivors taken years after the war. That same expression, that same unsettling quality of something looking out through human eyes. Joseph Martinez, who never felt cold again after being pulled from a flooded submarine, used to tell his children that something was still keeping him warm. "I can feel it," he would say, "like a presence, like I'm being taken care of." The official position of multiple military establishments remains unchanged. These incidents represent misidentified conventional treatment under traumatic circumstances. The survivors were helped by regular medical personnel, field medics, military doctors, naval corpsmen, and their trauma reimagined these helpers as something more mysterious. The unofficial position, the one shared in veterans' halls and whispered among military historians, is more complicated. Sometimes it seems survival itself is the mystery. Not how these men survived, but what price they paid for that survival. What was exchanged in those moments when death should have claimed them but didn't. The doctor, whatever or whoever he was, appears in the historical record for just a few months during one of the bloodiest winters of World War II. Then, the sightings stop. No more reports after March 1945. Either the phenomenon ended, or the men who encountered it learned to stay silent. But the effects lingered. They linger still, in the descendants of survivors who sometimes wake in the night feeling watched, in the medical anomalies that occasionally appear in their bloodlines, in the stories that families pass down in hushed voices. War transforms everyone it touches. Usually, that transformation is psychological trauma that reshapes how survivors see the world. But sometimes, if these accounts are to be believed, the transformation runs deeper. Sometimes it's physical, permanent, written into the body at a cellular level by silver thread and impossible hands. The fog of war obscures many things: truth, myth, the line between them. And sometimes, when the fog is thick enough, other things walk through it. Things that offer survival to the dying. Things that change the terms of life and death in ways we're not meant to understand. The war ended in 1945. The stories didn't. Even now, 80 years later, researchers occasionally uncover new accounts buried in letters, diaries, and declassified files. Always the same figure. Always the same, impossible survival. If you were bleeding out in a frozen forest, a bombed-out castle, or a flooded submarine, and something offered you survival at an unknown cost, would you say yes? Or would you already be too late to say no? If these accounts intrigue you and you want to hear more stories from the edges of military history, consider subscribing. We dive into the experiences that challenge what we think we know about war. Until next time, stay vigilant. Disclaimer. These stories are presented as submitted accounts and historical legends collected from various sources, including declassified military documents, personal correspondence, and recorded interviews with veterans and their families. The incidents described were reported by real military personnel, but interpretations of these events vary. Some details have been reconstructed based on available evidence and testimony. This content is presented for historical interest and entertainment purposes. Viewers are encouraged to research these topics independently and form their own conclusions. The producers make no claims regarding the supernatural elements described. No disrespect is intended toward veterans or military service members. These accounts are shared to preserve the full spectrum of wartime experiences, including those that remain unexplained.